My name is Zuri, and I am 32 years old. When I returned home from a grueling business trip in London, I found my driveway empty. My parents had sold my custom luxury car to pay for my golden child brother and his wife to take a lavish vacation. When I walked inside, my father smirked at me and said my car paid for their fun. I did not scream or cry. I simply poured a glass of water and smiled back. He shouted at me, demanding to know why I was so calm. I replied that the car he sold was actually a secured corporate asset under federal surveillance. I told him he did not just rob me, but he committed grand theft against the United States government. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the upscale neighborhoods of Bowie, Maryland meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My parents, Desmond and Valerie, hosted immaculate garden parties and networking dinners that made us look like the ideal upper-middle-class family. Behind closed doors, the dynamic was suffocating and deeply unequal. I was always treated as the workhorse. I was the independent daughter who needed no help, no praise, and absolutely no financial support. Meanwhile, my older brother Trayvon was the undeniable golden child who could do no wrong in their eyes. Trayvon is 35 now and still chasing his relentless delusions of becoming a billionaire entrepreneur. He has burned through countless business ventures, from failed cryptocurrency startups to luxury sneaker lines that never even saw a production factory. Every single time he failed, my parents were right there to catch his fall. They drained their own savings and made endless excuses for his reckless behavior. His wife, Chloe, only made the situation infinitely worse. Chloe is a woman obsessed with projecting extreme wealth and a fake lifestyle on social media. She constantly demands designer bags and five-star dinners and exotic trips to maintain her carefully curated online image. Last Thanksgiving, when I refused to invest $10,000 into his latest doomed application idea, Chloe actually had the nerve to look at me across the dinner table and say that my money could never buy me a husband, so I might as well spend it on family. My parents said absolutely nothing to defend me. They just nodded along like I was being completely unreasonable. The unspoken expectation in my family was incredibly clear. Because I am a single and financially independent woman with a high-paying career and no children, my money and resources were viewed as a community pot for his constant emergencies. If I refused to fund his lifestyle, I was immediately labeled selfish, bitter, and ungrateful. Over the years, I had learned to distance myself from their toxic demands. I created a peaceful, beautiful sanctuary in my own high-end townhouse. I work as a senior wealth advisor for some of the most elite and demanding clients in the country. My job requires intense focus and dedication. I thought maintaining physical distance and financial boundaries would be enough to protect my peace. I was completely wrong. It all started when I returned from a grueling but highly successful 2-week business trip in London. I was physically and mentally exhausted. I dragged my heavy luggage up the driveway of my home, dreaming only of a hot shower and my own bed. I pressed the button on my remote to open the garage door. As the heavy door slowly rattled open, my exhaustion instantly vanished. It was replaced by a cold wave of utter confusion and disbelief. The garage was completely empty. My custom black Porsche Panamera was gone. The vehicle was worth over $120,000. Panic flared in my chest. I rushed inside, fully expecting to find a broken window or a ransacked house. I prepared myself to call the police for a severe home invasion. Instead, I found my parents sitting comfortably in my living room. They had used their emergency spare key to let themselves in without my permission. They were drinking my expensive imported tea. They looked as relaxed and untroubled as if they were waiting for a Sunday church service to begin. I dropped my bags on the floor and demanded to know where my car was right that very second. My father, Desmond, is 62 years old and has always carried an air of absolute patriarchal authority. He did not even have the common decency to look guilty. Instead, he leaned back against the plush cushions of my velvet sofa and gave me a smug, patronizing look. He flatly stated that he had sold the car. He explained with absolute arrogance that a local private dealer had offered him $60,000 cash, and he took it without a second thought. I asked him why he would ever do something so incredibly malicious and illegal. He said Trayvon had been dealing with severe depression after his latest crypto venture completely collapsed. According to my father, Trayvon and Chloe desperately needed a mental health break. They needed a chance to reconnect and heal their marriage. So my parents decided to use the cash from my stolen luxury car to pay for their lavish over-the-top vow renewal trip to the Maldives. I stood there frozen in the foyer, staring at the people who were supposed to protect and love me. My mother, Valerie, who is 60 years old, chimed in immediately. Her voice was dripping with that manipulative, syrupy tone she always used when trying to gaslight me into submission. She said I should be grateful to have the opportunity to help my brother in his time of greatest need. She claimed the car was just a material possession. She called it a silly, excessive luxury that I could easily replace with my fancy corporate salary. She said Trayvon needed a massive win in his life. Since I had no husband and no real responsibilities tying me down, she argued I should not be so selfishly attached to a piece of metal. She said I was supposed to carry the family when they needed lifting up. To make matters worse, Desmond reached into his jacket pocket. He slid a piece of paper across my glass coffee table. It was a power of attorney form. It was complete with my forged signature and a fake notary stamp. Desmond had used this forged document to facilitate the illegal sale of the vehicle. He looked at me with absolute authority, expecting me to simply bow my head and accept this monumental betrayal for the sake of family harmony. They genuinely believed that because I had always taken the high road in the past, I would let them get away with this crime just to avoid a messy family scandal. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry and to throw a massive tantrum. They wanted me to hurl insults and eventually accept my forced role as the family financial martyr. I had done that so many times when we were kids, but I was no longer a helpless child seeking their conditional approval. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I walked over to the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I took a slow sip and looked my father right in the eye. I smiled. It was a wide, genuine smile that made the room temperature drop. Desmond frowned, clearly unnerved by my calm and collected demeanor. He shifted uncomfortably on the sofa and demanded to know why I was not reacting. He shouted, asking why I was so unnervingly calm about losing my most expensive possession. I placed the glass down on the marble counter and explained the harsh reality of the situation very clearly. I enunciated every single word so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. I told them that the car they had just illegally sold on the black market did not actually belong to me. It was a corporate vehicle. It was a highly secured asset entrusted to me by the global wealth management firm I worked for. I explained that because it was registered to a financial institution that handles billions of dollars in elite assets, the car was equipped with hidden military-grade GPS and federal surveillance trackers designed to protect executives from theft. The arrogant smugness melted off his face instantly. It was replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. I told him that whoever bought that car was already being tracked. By forging my signature, he committed grand theft against the United States government. Panic immediately filled the quiet living room. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds before the sheer terror on my father's face contorted into something much uglier. Instead of apologizing, expressing remorse, or even begging for forgiveness, Desmond doubled down with aggressive, unyielding fury. He stood up abruptly from my velvet sofa, his large frame towering over me, attempting to use the exact same patriarchal rage that had kept my mother and brother in line for decades. His face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson as he pointed a trembling, authoritative finger directly at my chest. He commanded me to fix the disaster he had just created. He ordered me to immediately pick up my phone call, my firm's corporate security division, and lie through my teeth. He demanded that I spin a pathetic, fabricated story to my superiors, insisting that I tell them I had simply lent the luxury vehicle to a careless friend for the weekend, and that the illegal transfer of title and paperwork was just a massive, harmless misunderstanding. He actually expected me to perjure myself to risk my hard-earned career, my prestigious financial licenses, and my very freedom all to shield him from the severe legal consequences of his own staggering arrogance. I stared at his red, furious face, at the veins popping in his neck, and a sound erupted from the back of my throat. I laughed. It was a cold, sharp, and utterly humorless laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my foyer, slicing through his manufactured authority. My father stepped back, completely bewildered by my reaction. He had never heard me laugh at his commands before. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into my tailored blazer pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the illuminated screen. I did not call my firm. I bypassed my corporate security division entirely. I dialed the local police department and firmly tapped the speakerphone icon, placing the device flat on the cool marble countertop so my parents could hear every single devastating ring. When the emergency dispatcher answered, asking for the nature of my emergency, I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I stated my full legal name, my home address, and calmly reported a grand theft auto involving a federally tracked corporate asset. I provided the exact make, the specific model, the license plate number, and the undeniable identity of the man who had forged my signature to illegally sell it. My mother let out a strangled, horrified gasp, clutching her chest and sinking back into the sofa as if she were having a sudden heart attack. Desmond lunged forward across the kitchen island, frantically trying to swipe the phone off the counter to end the call, but I snatched it away with lightning speed, my eyes locked dead on his. The dispatcher instructed me to stay put, while police units were immediately dispatched to my location. I hung up the phone, walked purposefully over to my front door, and yanked it wide open. A torrential Maryland downpour was relentlessly battering the paved driveway. The harsh wind was howling, whipping heavy sheets of cold rain across the pristine front porch. I looked back at my parents, who were standing absolutely frozen in my living room, paralyzed by the reality of their actions, and I told them to get out. Valerie began to weep loudly, pleading and begging me to be reasonable, to remember that we were blood. But I simply pointed a rigid finger out into the raging storm. I stood my ground and watched them stumble out into the freezing rain. Their expensive, carefully chosen clothes instantly soaked their perfect, untouchable facade, completely and utterly ruined. The very second they crossed the threshold, I slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them. Without missing a single beat, I opened the smart home security application on my phone and instantly scrambled the digital codes to every single smart lock on the entire property. They were locked out effectively and permanently, both from my home and from my life. The next morning, the violent storm outside had finally passed, but the storm in my personal life was just beginning to intensify. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of strong, dark roast coffee, meticulously reviewing the initial police report I had filed the previous night. Suddenly, my phone vibrated aggressively against the granite countertop, shattering the morning silence. A FaceTime request illuminated the screen. It was Trayvon. I accepted the video call, fully expecting to see my brother in a state of absolute panic, begging for a way out of the monumental legal disaster our father had carelessly created for him. Instead, the screen instantly filled with blinding tropical sunlight and the sparkling, crystal-clear azure waters of the Indian Ocean. Trayvon and his wife Chloe were lounging lazily on the pristine teak deck of a massive multi-million-dollar private yacht. They were both wearing oversized designer sunglasses, their skin glistening with expensive tanning oil. Chloe leaned aggressively into the camera frame, holding up a delicate crystal flute filled to the brim with vintage champagne. She was completely, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic federal mess unfolding back in Maryland. She shoved her left hand directly toward the camera lens, making absolutely sure the bright island sunlight caught the massive, newly upgraded diamond ring, sparkling obnoxiously on her finger. She let out a high-pitched, grating laugh and decided to use her luxurious tropical backdrop to actively mock me. She told me to look closely at what real happiness looked like. She smirked into the camera, her lips curled in a condescending sneer, and advised me to stop being such a bitter single workaholic. She boldly stated that if I stopped obsessing over my demanding career and my corporate status, maybe I could finally find a wealthy man to treat me like royalty exactly the way Trayvon treated her. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive champagne, her eyes dancing with malicious, unearned triumph, completely reveling in the grand illusion of her superiority. I looked at her smug, sun-kissed face through the glowing digital screen, my expression perfectly terrifyingly neutral. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not match her petty high school energy or defend my life choices. I simply sat there in silence and let her finish her pathetic gloating before I finally spoke. I calmly reminded Chloe of our tense family dinner last Thanksgiving, specifically bringing up the exact moment when she had looked down her nose at me across the table and proudly declared that my hard-earned money could never buy a husband. I watched her arrogant smile falter for a fraction of a second, visibly confused as to why I was bringing up a past insult while she was desperately trying to flaunt her current stolen luxury. I leaned closer to the camera, making sure my voice was crystal clear and icy over the sound of the ocean waves crashing behind them. I replied that she was absolutely right. My money could not buy a husband. No, I said, maintaining steady, unblinking eye contact, but it can buy a federal indictment. I told her to enjoy the warm sun while she still could because her vacation was about to come to a devastating end. Before either of them could process the severe weight of the warning or ask a single panicked question, I tapped the red button and abruptly ended the call, instantly cutting off their stolen tropical paradise and plunging my kitchen back into total focused silence. I did not wait around for their frantic, inevitable callback. I dressed in my sharpest, most intimidating tailored suit, gathered my meticulously organized files, and drove straight to my wealth management firm's sleek, glass-walled headquarters in downtown Washington. I bypassed my own office completely and walked directly into the expansive corner suite belonging to Elijah. Elijah is 34 years old, a brilliantly sharp corporate lawyer, and unequivocally my closest, most trusted ally at the entire firm. We had ruthlessly navigated brutal corporate mergers and hostile financial takeovers together, and he knew exactly how to handle high-stakes, catastrophic crises. I placed the forged power of attorney document and the freshly printed police report directly on his massive, uncluttered desk. Elijah did not waste time with polite pleasantries. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the legal documents with predatory, intense focus. He immediately tapped into his extensive professional network, making a few discreet, highly secured calls to his deep contacts within the local and federal law enforcement agencies. Within 20 tense minutes, he had a definitive update. The police had successfully tracked the hidden military-grade GPS signal from my stolen corporate Porsche. The vehicle had been traced directly to a man named Dante, a 40-year-old notorious black market dealer known specifically for moving high-value stolen luxury assets through a sophisticated underground criminal syndicate. Dante was already heavily on the authorities' radar, and Desmond handing him a tracked federal corporate vehicle was the absolute equivalent of wrapping a massive criminal indictment in a neat, undeniable little bow. But as Elijah relayed this victory, he did not look triumphant. He leaned back slowly in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together, his sharp analytical mind already calculating the hidden variables of the situation. He looked at the paperwork spread across his desk, then looked directly at me, his expression turning incredibly grave. He pointed out a glaring, undeniable mathematical flaw in the narrative my father had provided. Desmond had sold the corporate Porsche to Dante for exactly $60,000 in untraceable cash. Elijah pulled up a blank, highly detailed spreadsheet on his dual monitors and started ruthlessly crunching the numbers. He factored in the current peak seasonal rates for an exclusive, five-star luxury resort in the Maldives. He added the exorbitant daily cost of chartering a massive private fully staffed yacht in the middle of the Indian Ocean. He carefully calculated the estimated staggering value of the massive diamond ring upgrade Chloe had just shoved aggressively in my face on FaceTime. He tapped his expensive pen rhythmically against the mahogany desk, the sound amplifying the sudden heavy tension in the room. He looked me dead in the eye and stated the absolute undeniable truth. $60,000 was barely a fraction of what Trayvon and Chloe were currently spending on their tropical, over-the-top vow renewal. The cash from my stolen car might have covered their first-class international flights and maybe a few nights at the luxury resort, but it absolutely did not explain the private yacht, the massive new diamonds, or the limitless vintage champagne. The math simply did not add up under any logical scrutiny. Elijah closed the spreadsheet with a sharp click of his mouse and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious hushed tone that sent a chill straight down my spine. He told me that Desmond illegally selling the corporate car was just the visible tip of a massive, destructive iceberg. Trayvon had to be getting the rest of that exorbitant funding from somewhere else. There was another far more dangerous financial leak in play, and given my family's long, toxic history of viewing my assets as their own personal piggy bank, Elijah warned me that this secondary massive leak was almost certainly connected directly to my identity. The air in Elijah's office grew cold and heavy as his words sank in. Connected directly to my identity. The implication was staggering but entirely plausible, given the absolute lack of boundaries my family possessed. I authorized Elijah to initiate a comprehensive deep dive financial background check immediately. We bypassed standard credit monitoring applications and tapped straight into the firm's elite security clearance systems. This was no longer just a simple case of property theft. We were digging into what felt like severe financial treason. Elijah's fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard with practiced precision. The large dual monitors on his desk reflected complex strings of data and federal banking portals that only authorized wealth management executives could access. I sat perfectly still while my heart hammered violently against my ribs. I had meticulously guarded my financial independence. I maintained an immaculate credit score of over 800. I secured my assets and kept my banking completely separate from the toxic vortex of my parents and brother. I thought I built an impenetrable fortress around my livelihood. But as the loading bars on Elijah's screen slowly filled, I realized that a fortress is completely useless if the enemy already possesses the master keys. The silence in the room stretched on for several agonizing minutes. The only sound was the sharp clicking of the mouse and the low hum of the air conditioning unit above us. Elijah pulled up my master credit file directly from the federal banking reservoir. He stopped typing and stared at the screen. His usually calm and unreadable face morphed into a mask of pure, unfiltered shock. He slowly turned one of the monitors toward me. He did not say a word. He just pointed at the screen. I leaned forward and scanned the glowing rows of financial data. My stomach completely dropped out from under me. The betrayal I felt earlier over the stolen corporate vehicle was absolutely nothing compared to the monumental financial sabotage staring back at me. This was not a mistake. This was a highly targeted execution of my financial future, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. I could feel a physical sickness rising rapidly in my throat. I had spent countless days and nights sacrificing my personal time to build a pristine financial foundation. My family had always deeply resented my ability to generate wealth because it gave me absolute freedom from their twisted control. Now they had bypassed my boundaries entirely. They weaponized the very system I worked in. Elijah remained completely motionless beside me. His eyes darted across the glowing numbers with grim calculation. He knew exactly what this meant for my career and my professional licenses. The federal banking regulations are incredibly strict regarding personal financial integrity. Having massive fraudulent debt linked directly to my name could easily jeopardize my employment status. They were actively attempting to absolutely destroy my entire livelihood. Trayvon had not just used the $60,000 in dirty cash from my stolen car. That money was merely the down payment for his fraudulent lifestyle. The extensive background check revealed that my golden child brother had somehow stolen my social security number. He used my protected federal identity to secretly open 3 top-tier platinum credit cards. These were elite accounts with massive spending limits, designed specifically for high-net-worth individuals, like my wealthy corporate clients. And Trayvon had completely maxed out every single one of them within days. The screen showed a horrifying cascade of exorbitant international charges. There were first-class international flights to the Maldives. There were deposits for the private yacht. There were ridiculous luxury charges for vintage champagne and island excursions. There was a staggering $80,000 charge at an exclusive luxury jeweler located directly in London. That specific transaction explained the massive diamond ring Chloe had so proudly shoved in my face on the video call earlier that exact morning. They were literally wearing my stolen financial security like a cheap holiday souvenir. But the most horrifying question remained absolutely unanswered. How did Trayvon manage to bypass the intense federal security checks required to open those elite accounts in my name? The banks usually require extreme verification for premium platinum cards. I looked at Elijah, demanding immediate answers. He clicked through to the digital application signatures and enlarged the federal files. The blood roared in my ears. The kicker was right there in black and white text. Trayvon had not acted alone in this scheme. My father Desmond had actively and willingly participated in the total destruction of my identity. Desmond used his legal status as my biological father to illegally co-sign the fraudulent credit applications. He bypassed the complex security questions because he fundamentally knew my mother's maiden name and the exact street I grew up on and the name of my first childhood pet. He weaponized his parental knowledge to maliciously manipulate the bank representatives and forcefully push the approvals directly through the automated system. My own father had effectively acted as a criminal guarantor for my brother's blatant identity theft. They were orchestrating a massive synchronized financial hit on my clean record. Their ultimate plan was incredibly clear and deeply malicious from the very beginning. They fully intended to completely obliterate my immaculate credit score while they gleefully partied on a private yacht overseas. They planned to deliberately leave me holding the bag for hundreds of thousands of dollars in completely fraudulent debt. They arrogantly thought I would be too scared of a public family embarrassment to actually report them to the proper authorities. They firmly believed I would just silently pay off the astronomical financial balances to aggressively protect my own demanding career and spotless reputation. They viewed my flawless credit score as nothing more than a freely available, disposable, convenient resource to eternally fund the deeply spoiled golden child without any fear of facing real consequences. I sat back in the plush leather chair and let the staggering magnitude of their crime wash over me. The anger in my chest instantly hardened into freezing ice. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a serious federal crime. Elijah asked if I wanted to call them. He asked if I wanted to angrily confront my father or scream at my brother across the ocean. I shook my head slowly. I did not want to call them. I did not want to argue with thieves. Arguing implies that there is a mutual negotiation. It gives them a chance to deploy their toxic guilt trips and emotionally manipulate the narrative. I was permanently done talking. I instructed Elijah to prepare the official documentation. I acted with cold, calculated precision. I did not shed a single tear over the loss of my family because they had officially ceased being my family the exact moment they forged my signature. I logged into the restricted federal banking portal using my executive credentials. I bypassed the standard customer service lines and contacted the Elite Fraud Division directly. I formally filed an official identity theft and fraud report with the federal bank. I submitted the undeniable digital proof of the forged credit applications alongside my verified employment and geographical location records. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was definitively out of the country on a business trip in London when these fraudulent platinum accounts were illegally opened back in Maryland. The federal bank investigators immediately flagged the massive pending charges. With one single decisive click of my computer mouse, I ruthlessly executed the ultimate retaliation. I completely froze every single active fraudulent platinum account. I instantly severed the financial bloodline that was actively funding their luxurious Maldives trip. The massive credit limits that Trayvon and Chloe were relying on to buy expensive dinners and charter their private boats were instantly locked down and rendered completely useless. I did not stop there. I worked closely with Elijah to permanently flag Desmond's personal banking accounts as an integral part of an active federal fraud investigation. My father had used his own traceable digital footprint to electronically authorize the fake notary stamp and digitally co-sign the fraudulent bank applications. By directly linking his accounts to the federal crime, I ensured that his remaining assets would be heavily scrutinized and potentially permanently frozen by the investigating federal authorities. I sat quietly in the corner office and silently watched the glowing status bars turn from bright green to solid red on the computer screen. The fraudulent accounts were securely locked. The stolen funds were permanently halted. The inescapable trap was firmly set. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. Trayvon and Chloe were currently sitting on a private yacht situated in the middle of the Indian Ocean, eagerly racking up thousands of dollars in daily charges. They were happily sipping vintage champagne and comfortably basking in the tropical sun, feeling completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that their supposedly unlimited funding had just instantly evaporated into thin air. I closed the laptop. The sharp click echoed through Elijah's office with a sense of absolute finality. The digital trap was set. There was no way out for them now. I thanked Elijah and walked out of the glass-walled building into the Washington evening. I drove back to my highly secured townhouse in Maryland. The evening passed in tranquil silence. I made dinner, poured a glass of wine, and prepared my corporate wardrobe for the following workday. I knew the mathematical reality of the time zones. Maryland was a cool evening, but the Maldives was rapidly approaching the middle of the next day. This was the precise moment when hotel management would run daily authorizations for high-value luxury accommodations. I went to sleep with my phone resting face up on my nightstand, the volume turned up. I wanted to hear every frantic vibration when reality finally crashed down on them. At exactly 3 a.m, the violent barrage began. My phone erupted in a chaotic frenzy of flashing lights and relentless digital alarms. The screen illuminated the dark bedroom, rapidly filling with a desperate avalanche of notifications. Missed calls from Trayvon, frantic text messages from Chloe, urgent voice memos piling up in a rapidly growing stack of unadulterated panic. I sat up slowly, leaning against my headboard, the glow reflecting off my calm face. I did not answer the first 7 calls. I simply watched the caller identification flash across the glass, visualizing the chaos unfolding on a tropical island on the exact opposite side of the planet. By the 8th call, I swiped the green icon and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy panicked breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for him to finally break the silence. Trayvon's voice shattered the quiet atmosphere of my bedroom. He was practically hyperventilating, his words tumbling out in a high-pitched screech of terror that sounded absolutely nothing like the smug man who had flaunted a stolen lifestyle just hours ago. He screamed my name, begging me to listen. The background noise was a chaotic symphony of disaster. I could clearly hear the sharp voices of disgruntled resort staff and the unmistakable sobbing of Chloe. Trayvon frantically explained that they were standing in the middle of the opulent lobby of their 5-star Maldivian resort. They had just attempted to finalize the payment for their extravagant yacht excursion, and the platinum credit card had violently declined. He confidently handed the concierge a second platinum card, expecting a banking glitch, only to watch the machine flash a severe fraud warning. The third card triggered an automated lockdown of the merchant terminal. Trayvon realized in an instant that he was entirely trapped. The situation had instantly escalated to a catastrophic criminal emergency. The resort management was not treating this as a simple banking error. Because the cards had been flagged directly by a federal fraud division, the international merchant system alerted the Maldivian Hospitality Security Network. Trayvon sobbed into the phone, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. He told me that the hotel general manager had confiscated my stolen credit cards and was actively threatening to call the local island authorities. The Maldives takes hospitality fraud incredibly seriously. Attempting to defraud a luxury resort out of tens of thousands of dollars is a severe criminal offense. Trayvon was completely surrounded by angry hotel security guards. They were refusing to let him or Chloe return to their oceanfront villa to collect their passports. He screamed that they were going to be arrested, detained in a foreign jail cell, and charged with international financial fraud. Chloe could be heard wailing in the background, aggressively crying about her ruined reputation and the unbearable humiliation of being treated like a common criminal in front of other elite vacationers. Trayvon demanded that I fix it immediately. He completely dropped the terrified victim act for a fleeting second to desperately reclaim his entitled arrogance. He commanded me to call the federal bank right that very second. He ordered me to authorize the pending charges, lift the security freeze, and unconditionally validate the platinum card so he could pay the furious resort manager. He actually had the mind-boggling audacity to tell me that we could figure out repayment logistics when he got back to Maryland, but right now I needed to protect the family name. He tried to manipulate my emotions, begging me to think about our parents, pleading with me to save his brand new wife from the horror of a foreign jail. I sat perfectly still, letting his pathetic demands echo through the silent room. I felt no pity. I felt no sisterly obligation. I only felt a satisfying sense of justice. I took a deep breath, ensuring my voice was perfectly level. I spoke clearly into the receiver, making sure he heard every syllable over the chaotic background noise. I told him he made a critical miscalculation when he decided to steal my federal identity. I said I was not his personal bank, I was not his protective shield, and I was no longer his sister. I delivered the final blow with precision. I said, identity thieves do not get bailouts. Before he could scream another frantic demand, I pulled the phone away and firmly pressed the red button. I navigated to his contact profile and permanently blocked his number. I did the same thing to Chloe. I silenced the device, placed it onto my nightstand, and pulled the covers over my shoulders. I fell into a restful sleep, leaving them to face the severe consequences of their monumental greed. When I woke up a few hours later, the sun was shining brightly through my bedroom windows. As I went through my morning routine, I knew exactly what was currently happening a few miles away in my parents' sprawling suburban house. Trayvon, cut off from my financial resources and out of options, would have dialed our father in a state of blind panic. Desmond and Valerie would have been brutally jolted awake in the middle of the night by the terrifying news that their golden boy was facing imminent arrest on a foreign island. I could easily picture the unadulterated chaos unfolding in their living room. Desmond would have spent hours frantically calling his own banks, desperately trying to wire emergency funds to the Maldives to cover the exorbitant resort bill and save Trayvon from the local authorities. Desmond's financial power was completely neutralized. Elijah and I acted quickly, setting the fraud investigation into motion the previous afternoon. When Desmond attempted to wire funds overseas, he would have discovered the devastating truth. His banking accounts were locked down, flagged by authorities due to his involvement in co-signing the fraudulent cards. The financial bloodline was severed. My parents were paralyzed, unable to send a dime to rescue their son from the mess they conspired to create. Valerie would be hysterically crying, unable to process the reality that their actions had ruined Trayvon's life and compromised their own stability. My parents were backed into a corner. They realized with horrifying clarity that I was the only person who possessed the power to lift the flags and authorize the funds required to save Trayvon from spending years inside a foreign jail cell. They needed to force my hand. They would have driven straight to my townhouse, fully intending to demand compliance. But my property was a digital fortress. The smart locks were scrambled, the cameras were actively recording, and my gated community required specific authorization, which I explicitly revoked. They could not get near my porch. Realizing my home was impenetrable, Desmond and Valerie escalated their tactics. They could not reach me by phone because I aggressively blocked their numbers. They were running out of time as the situation in the Maldives grew more dire. They needed to corner me in a location where I could not easily escape, a place where the intense pressure of public scrutiny might force me to cave to their demands. They knew how highly I valued my professional reputation and career in wealth management. They calculated that if they ambushed me in front of my elite colleagues, I would be forced to submit to protect my corporate standing. Desmond and Valerie, dressed in authoritative clothing, attempting to project an image of concerned parents rather than desperate fraud co-conspirators. They climbed into the sedan and drove toward downtown Washington. They planned to ambush me directly in the main lobby of my firm. They intended to create a public scene demanding that I release the funds and save my brother. They banked on the assumption that I would do anything to prevent a family meltdown at work. They were completely unaware that I was already steps ahead of them, and that bringing their criminal behavior into my secured corporate environment was the worst mistake they could make. I arrived at my office at 8 o'clock sharp. My firm's headquarters is a masterclass in corporate intimidation. The sprawling main lobby features Italian marble floors, towering glass walls, and a brushed steel reception desk manned by highly trained guards. It is a place of quiet authority where global portfolios are handled with clinical precision. The clients who walk through our doors expect absolute perfection. They do not expect to witness an unhinged spectacle unfolding in front of the morning coffee station. I was upstairs in the secure executive boardroom finalizing a risk assessment with Elijah when my desk phone abruptly illuminated. It was the head of lobby security. His tone was strictly professional but audibly strained. He informed me that 4 individuals claiming to be my family had bypassed the visitor checkpoint and were causing a severe public disturbance. He asked if I wanted them forcibly removed from the premises by the armed guards. I looked across the polished mahogany table at Elijah. He checked his luxury watch, a subtle calculating smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The timing of their desperate ambush was flawless. I firmly told security to hold their position and let me handle it personally. I did not rush. I took a deliberate sip of my sparkling water, smoothed the lapels of my tailored power suit, and walked with total purpose toward the glass elevators. As the clear cab descended through the central atrium, the chaotic scene unfolding below came into sharp focus. My parents had not come alone. They had brought their favorite reinforcements. Flanking my weeping mother were Aunt Beatrice and Aunt Clara, my father's bitter older sisters. These 2 judgmental women were the terrifying matriarchs of our extended family gossip network. They were notorious for their hypocritical judgment and their toxic belief in absolute patriarchal authority. They were the ultimate enforcers of unconditional family compliance. When the heavy glass elevator doors slid open, the staggering volume of the commotion hit me like a physical wave. Valerie was putting on a performance. She was standing in the very center of the pristine marble lobby, her hands clasped dramatically over her chest, wet mascara, tears streaming down her face. She was wailing loudly enough for every receptionist, advisor, and client to clearly hear every single melodramatic word. She cried out that her precious son was going to die in a terrifying foreign prison. She sobbed hysterically that he was being held hostage in the Maldives simply because his own sister was a vindictive monster who cared more about her corporate money than her own flesh and blood family. Aunt Beatrice, wearing a floral dress and a look of self-righteous indignation, was pointing an accusing finger at the security guards who were trying to gently corral them away from the entrance. Beatrice loudly declared that I was a thoroughly unnatural daughter. She shouted to the entire horrified lobby that I had heartlessly abandoned my family in their darkest hour of need, greedily hoarding my wealth, while my completely innocent brother was being psychologically tortured abroad. Desmond stood slightly behind the wailing women, attempting to look like the stoic, heartbroken patriarch. He kept looking around the crowded lobby, purposefully making mournful eye contact with my senior colleagues, actively trying to garner maximum public sympathy. His strategy was incredibly transparent. He desperately wanted to shame me into absolute submission. He fully believed that the unbearable embarrassment of having my family eagerly air our dirty criminal laundry in front of my elite peers would force me to drag them into a soundproof conference room to silently negotiate. He arrogantly assumed I would try to freeze the public spectacle by quietly agreeing to immediately unfreeze the fraudulent platinum credit cards. He severely underestimated the sheer depth of my unwavering resolve. I did not scurry out of the elevator like a frightened child. I did not lower my head in deep, burning shame. I did not rush forward to usher them out of public sight to protect my own fragile image. I stepped directly into the bright center of the corporate lobby, with the terrifying confidence of a powerful woman who held every single winning card in the deck. My heavy designer heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, instantly drawing the undivided attention of the entire room. The shocked whispers abruptly stopped. The armed security guards immediately stepped back, forming a wide protective perimeter around me. Valerie saw me confidently approaching and instantly amplified her theatrical sobbing. She lunged forward, desperately reaching out to grab my tailored arm, wailing that I had to call the federal bank and save Trayvon Wright this very second. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I simply held up a single uncompromising hand, stopping her dead in her frantic tracks. I told her to lower her voice immediately, or I would personally have her arrested and prosecuted for criminal trespassing. The icy, unyielding authority in my tone caught her completely off guard. She physically recoiled as if she had been struck, her fake, manipulative tears instantly drying up. Aunt Clara forcefully stepped up, her wrinkled face pinched with furious judgment. She demanded to know how I could possibly be so cruel, how I could let my brother rot in a filthy cell when I had the financial power to instantly free him. I looked blankly at Clara, then turned my gaze to Beatrice, and finally locked eyes with my father, who was suddenly looking visibly nervous. I calmly reached into my expensive leather briefcase and pulled out two thick, perfectly bound, highly detailed presentation folders. I handed one heavy folder directly to Beatrice and shoved the other into Clara's waiting hands. I told them that since they were so deeply invested in private family matters, they desperately needed to review the verified facts before they continued screaming false accusations in a corporate lobby. Beatrice ripped open the cardboard folder with aggressive indignation, fully expecting to see private financial statements or simple bank balances. Instead, her wide eyes landed directly on a highly detailed official federal police report bearing my father's legal name. I spoke very clearly, meticulously, ensuring my voice carried across the quiet lobby so everyone could hear the absolute truth. I explicitly explained to my stunned aunts that my brother was not facing a foreign jail because of my actions. He was facing imminent international arrest because he maliciously stole my social security number, committed federal identity theft, and racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in entirely fraudulent luxury charges. I pointed directly to the highlighted second page of the thick folder. I told them to look very closely at the undeniable digital proof of the forged signatures on the bank applications. Then I turned my full, devastating attention directly to Desmond. I loudly announced to my shocked aunts and to everyone else silently listening that my father had actively and willingly facilitated this massive felony. I told them to turn the page and look at the official Federal Bureau of Investigation tracking report regarding my stolen corporate Porsche. I clearly explained that Desmond had illegally sold a federally tracked, highly secured corporate asset to a known black market criminal syndicate just to fund his golden son's lavish vacation. The entire corporate lobby fell absolutely terrifyingly silent. Beatrice and Clara stood completely frozen, their eyes darting between the damning documents and their brother. Their self-righteous fury melted into horrified realization. Clara looked at Desmond, her voice trembling, asking him if this was actually true. Desmond opened his mouth to spin another desperate lie to gaslight his sisters, just like he had gaslighted me. He raised his hands, frantically insisting that it was just a massive family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He never got the chance to finish his pathetic, desperate sentence. The heavy revolving doors spun open with undeniable urgency. 4 fully uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives strode purposefully into the building. They did not come because of the noise or the public disturbance. They came because Elijah had meticulously coordinated their precise arrival. The officers bypassed the security desk entirely. They walked in a tight formation straight past me, completely ignoring Valerie's sudden gasp of absolute terror, and immediately flanked Desmond. The detective addressed Desmond by his legal name, loudly confirming his identity in front of the entire corporate staff. He formally informed my father that he was officially under arrest. He listed the criminal charges with brutal clarity: grand theft, auto identity theft, and wire fraud. But the final blow that permanently sealed his fate, without any possibility of bail, was the charge of felony forgery. The detective coldly explained that to expertly fake the vehicle title transfer to Dante, Desmond had physically broken into a local legal office and deliberately stolen an official notary stamp. The sharp click of cold steel handcuffs echoing through the marble lobby was easily the most satisfying sound I had ever heard anywhere. The immediate aftermath of my father's arrest sent shockwaves through whatever was left of my family's crumbling facade. Desmond spent exactly 48 grueling hours inside a federal holding facility before Valerie could secure his conditional release. Bailing him out was a monumental task that completely drained the very last remnants of their joint savings accounts. They liquidated their emergency funds, drained their meager retirement portfolios, and scraped together every available cent just to meet the exorbitant bond requirements set by the federal judge. Desmond walked out of the detention center wearing the same wrinkled suit he had been arrested in, completely stripped of his arrogant patriarch persona. He was now a federally indicted felon facing years in prison, chained to an ankle monitor that tracked his every movement. Their financial ruin in Maryland was absolutely nothing compared to the international disaster actively suffocating Trayvon across the globe. The Maldivian Resort Management absolutely refused to show any mercy to luxury fraudsters. When the hotel general manager realized that the blocked platinum cards were tied to a federal identity theft investigation, he enacted the strictest hospitality protocols allowed by international law. Trayvon and Chloe were immediately stripped of their luxurious oceanfront villa and escorted by armed island security to a small windowless holding room near the staff quarters. The local authorities officially confiscated their American passports, effectively trapping them on the island indefinitely. They were explicitly informed that they would not be allowed to leave the country, step foot on a departing airplane, or contact the American embassy for extraction until every single dollar of their astronomical hotel debt was paid in full. Chloe's lavish dream honeymoon had rapidly dissolved into an inescapable tropical nightmare. They were surviving on basic staff rations, sleeping on rigid cots, and facing the very real threat of being transferred to a maximum security Maldivian prison if the funds did not materialize within the week. With my father's assets completely frozen and my financial fortress locked down tight, Trayvon had absolutely no one left to exploit. The golden child was finally trapped in a cage of his own making, and the bars were forged from his own insatiable greed. The harsh reality of their situation was a direct result of their lifelong assumption that actions never carried permanent consequences. Valerie, however, possessed a terrifying capacity for deeply entrenched delusion. Instead of accepting the horrific reality that her husband was a criminal and her beloved son was a thief, she aggressively doubled down on her twisted narrative. Valerie categorically refused to accept defeat. If the banks were locked and the federal investigators were circling, she would simply exploit a different, highly susceptible funding source. She turned her manipulative sights directly toward our tight-knit local community. Valerie immediately sprang into action, mobilizing the only deeply loyal network she had left. She aggressively organized a massive event she boldly dubbed the Save Our Family Barbecue. She hosted it on the sprawling green lawns of the St. Jude Community Church, the exact congregation our family had attended for 3 decades. My mother weaponized her long-standing position in the church choir and the Women's Auxiliary Board to instantly command blind sympathy. She printed out hundreds of glossy flyers, mobilized prayer chains, and set up multiple digital donation kiosks right next to the potato salad and grilled ribs. Her ultimate goal was to rapidly raise the hundreds of thousands of dollars required to pay off Trayvon's massive hotel debt and secure high-powered criminal defense attorneys for Desmond. But asking for charity required a compelling victim narrative, and Valerie crafted a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated fiction. She stood at the church podium wiping away highly rehearsed tears and deliberately spun a horrific lie to the entire congregation. She passionately proclaimed that her brilliant son and devoted husband were the innocent victims of a malicious corporate conspiracy. She told the eager, gossiping church members that I had suffered a severe, catastrophic psychotic break, She loudly declared that the immense pressure of my high-powered executive job had completely fractured my mind. According to Valerie's fabricated gospel, I had maliciously framed my own father for fraud and deliberately stranded my innocent brother in a foreign country simply out of bitter, unprovoked jealousy over his beautiful new marriage. She painted me as a ruthless, unhinged monster who was using federal authorities to enact a baseless vendetta against a perfectly loving family. The deeply gullible congregation swallowed every single poisonous word. The church ladies whispered prayers for my damaged soul while simultaneously writing massive checks to free the falsely accused patriarch and rescue the stranded honeymooners. My mother was actively turning my own community against me, using my carefully protected reputation as the sacrificial lamb to fund their criminal bailout. The sheer audacity of her scheme was breathtaking. She firmly believed that if she controlled the public narrative, she could bully me into absolute submission while simultaneously harvesting the charity of innocent churchgoers who simply thought they were doing the Lord's work. The news of the church barbecue reached me quickly. A former high school friend who still attended St. Jude forwarded me the digital flyer along with a highly concerned text message asking if I was actually experiencing a mental health crisis. I sat in my quiet, secure townhouse staring at the glossy digital image of my mother smiling bravely through fake tears. The anger that flared inside my chest was freezing cold. Elijah called me precisely 10 minutes later. He had also caught wind of the ridiculous community fundraiser through his own local network. Elijah, always the voice of calm, calculated reason, strongly advised me to stay as far away from the church event as humanly possible. He warned me that walking into that heavily manipulated environment was exactly like walking blindly into an active hornet's nest. He logically argued that confronting a massive crowd of brainwashed, highly emotional churchgoers would only validate my mother's toxic narrative that I was unhinged and aggressive. He told me to let the federal authorities handle the criminal fallout and to permanently wash my hands of the entire catastrophic situation. It was sound, rational, and completely professional advice. But Elijah did not fully understand the specific suffocating dynamics of my community. He did not grasp that in our neighborhood, silence is never interpreted as taking the high road. Silence is always interpreted as a guilty confession. If I stayed hidden in my secure townhouse and allowed my mother's vicious lies to echo unchallenged through the church pews, her fabricated narrative would permanently solidify into established truth. I refused to let the people I grew up with look at me with misplaced pity or quiet disgust. I refused to let innocent, hardworking community members be financially drained by a family of unapologetic con artists. Valerie wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to play the grieving, desperate mother fighting for her falsely accused men. I decided it was time to give the congregation the exact truth served with absolute uncompromising evidence. I thanked Elijah for his counsel, politely ignored his final warnings, and ended the call. I walked methodically into my expansive walk-in closet. I did not choose something casual or unassuming. I selected my sharpest, most intimidating corporate armor. I pulled out a pristine, tailored crimson designer suit that radiated undeniable authority and absolute control. I carefully fastened a heavy diamond-encrusted watch around my wrist. It was a deliberate symbol of the legitimate wealth I had meticulously built with my own hands, completely free of their filthy criminal contamination. I paired it with sleek, polished stiletto heels that echoed with executive power. I pulled my hair back into a flawless, severe style that left no room for vulnerability. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, creating a mask of unwavering confidence. I was not walking into that church as the broken, psychotic daughter Valerie had described. I was arriving as the highly successful wealth management executive who had ruthlessly taken down an international fraud ring. I walked into my home office and picked up a massive, thick leather binder. It was not a prop. It was a meticulously organized weapon of mass destruction. The binder contained every single piece of undeniable evidence. It held high-resolution prints of the forged bank signatures, federal tracking reports proving the stolen notary stamp, and detailed financial logs exposing the illicit black market sale of the corporate Porsche. It even contained the specific geolocated login data, proving Trayvon had orchestrated the identity theft. I grasped the heavy leather binder firmly in my hand, locked my townhouse, and slid into the driver's seat of my rental vehicle. I drove steadily toward the St. Jude Community Church, my mind perfectly clear and my resolve absolutely unbreakable. The 20-minute journey across town felt incredibly brief. I deliberately parked perfectly parallel to the main bustling, heavily crowded church courtyard. I was about to crash the biggest fraudulent charity event of the decade, and I was bringing the unadulterated truth with me. I stepped out of the rental vehicle and let the car door slam shut behind me. The sound cut through the muggy Maryland afternoon. The St. Jude Community Church courtyard was a chaotic sea of summer dresses, pressed suits, and running children. The scent of smoked ribs hung thick in the humid air. A gospel band was playing an uplifting tune on a small wooden stage near the fellowship hall. My mother stood near the massive brick entrance, gripping a stack of glossy donation flyers. She was surrounded by a tight circle of sympathetic church elders, playing her role as the deeply wronged matriarch with sickening perfection. I gripped the thick leather binder in my hand and began my slow, deliberate walk across the freshly mowed lawn. My crimson designer suit acted like a vibrant flare against the sea of muted pastel church attire. I did not rush my pace. I let the rhythmic clicking of my stilettos announce my bold arrival. The transformation of the courtyard was instantaneous. The joyful laughter nearest the parking lot abruptly died. The sudden silence rippled outward like a tidal wave, infecting group after group until it finally reached the wooden stage. The lead singer faltered, missing a crucial beat before signaling the band to bring the music to a jarring halt. Hundreds of horrified eyes turned to stare directly at me. Hushed, frantic whispers erupted instantly across the vast courtyard. The entire congregation was watching the supposedly psychotic daughter confidently stride onto their holy ground. Valerie noticed the sudden drop in volume and turned around. The moment she saw my crimson suit and the heavy leather binder in my hand, the color completely drained from her face. Her flawless performance as the grieving matriarch shattered for a terrifying fraction of a second, revealing the cornered fraudster hiding underneath. But she quickly recovered her composure, puffing out her chest and marching aggressively toward me, flanked by two burly church ushers. She threw her arms wide, projecting her voice so the entire silent courtyard could hear her righteous indignation. She dramatically commanded me to turn around and leave the sacred church grounds immediately. She wailed loudly that I had already done enough damage to our perfectly innocent family, and that I had absolutely no right to bring my toxic, unhinged energy to a holy place of healing and prayer. She pointed a trembling finger toward the busy street, ordering the ushers to escort her mentally unstable daughter back to her car before I could cause another psychotic scene. I did not even break my stride. I looked right through my frantic mother as if she were invisible. I bypassed her arms and walked past the hesitant ushers who were too intimidated by my authority to intervene. I marched down the center aisle of the folding chairs, making a determined beeline for the stage. The massive congregation parted like the Red Sea, pulling their children back and staring at me with a potent mixture of shock and fascination. I stepped onto the stage, the planks groaning slightly under the points of my heels. I walked to the microphone stand my mother had been using to broadcast her pathetic, fraudulent pleas for charity. I adjusted the metal stand with a sharp screech that made several people in the front row flinch. I did not yell, scream, cry, or perform like Valerie had been doing all afternoon. I leaned into the microphone and let my voice wash over the stunned courtyard with a dangerous, icy calmness. The amplified sound was perfectly steady, radiating the terrifying certainty of a woman holding verified facts. I welcomed the St. Jude congregation to the afternoon barbecue. I thanked them for their incredible generosity and willingness to open their wallets for a family in an alleged crisis. Then I explicitly informed them that every single word my mother had spoken today was a calculated, malicious lie. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the packed courtyard. I set my leather binder down on the podium and flipped it wide open. I told the crowd they were not raising money to rescue an innocent man from a foreign jail or a wrongfully accused patriarch from a massive federal misunderstanding. I revealed they were actively funding an organized international fraud ring orchestrated by the people serving potato salad in front of them. Valerie screamed hysterically from the back of the crowd, trying to drown out my voice, demanding someone cut power to the microphone. She flailed her arms, screaming at the top of her lungs that I was having a mental breakdown. I ignored her frantic cries completely. I reached into the binder and pulled out a thick stack of high-resolution copies of the federal receipts. I told the ushers standing near the stage that if they truly cared about the integrity of their beloved church, they would distribute these packets to the congregation immediately. The sheer commanding authority in my voice compelled them to obey without question. They took the thick stacks of paper and began passing them down the long rows of folding chairs. I watched the confused, anxious churchgoers open the packets. I told them to look closely at the first page. It was a crystal clear, official copy of the Federal Bureau of Investigation tracking report. I calmly explained that the report proved my father Desmond had stolen my corporate vehicle, forged a legal notary stamp, and sold the expensive car to a criminal syndicate. I told them to look at the second page, which clearly displayed the forged banking documents. I explained exactly how my father used his parental knowledge to bypass federal security measures and illegally co-sign fraudulent platinum credit cards to endlessly fund my brother's incredibly luxurious lifestyle. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces and decided to make my presentation personal. I weaponized their own historical judgments against them. I scanned the front row and locked eyes with Auntie Brenda, a prominent church elder who always participated in Valerie's toxic community gossip. I spoke directly to her through the humming microphone. I asked her if she vividly remembered the church potluck 3 years ago. I reminded her how my mother had loudly complained to the entire Women's Auxiliary Board that my job in wealth management was not a real career. I reminded her how Valerie had mocked my grueling corporate hours, claiming I was wasting my life chasing fake money instead of finding a good husband. I paused for a long moment, letting the bitter, specific memory hang heavily in the humid air. Then I delivered the crushing blow. I told Auntie Brenda and the gasping congregation that this supposedly fake career was the exact target my family had just stolen $150,000 from. I instructed the stunned crowd to flip to the third page of the packet. I pointed out the high-quality photographs that had been forwarded to me from the Maldivian resort manager. The glossy pictures clearly showed Trayvon and Chloe lazily lounging on a private luxury yacht, holding chilled bottles of vintage champagne that cost significantly more than most of the congregation made in an entire month. I explicitly explained that while these hard-working, faithful church members were being actively begged to empty their modest bank accounts and blindly sacrifice their hard-earned paychecks, my brother was actively burning through stolen federal funds on a beautiful tropical island. I forcefully directed them to the final page of the thick packet. It was the official unredacted federal arrest warrant for Desmond, clearly listing the severe charges of felony forgery, wire fraud, and grand theft auto. I told the congregation that Desmond was absolutely not a victim of a corporate conspiracy or a vindictive psychotic daughter. He was a federally indicted felon, currently wearing a strict court-ordered ankle monitor. The community reaction was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The bustling courtyard descended into a deafening, horrifying silence as hundreds of people simultaneously read the undeniable proof. The evidence was absolute. The forged signatures were glaringly obvious. The precise dates on the federal tracking reports matched my timeline perfectly. The photographs of Trayvon's disgusting opulence destroyed any lingering ounce of blind sympathy. The church members slowly lowered the papers. They turned their heads, their facial expressions shifting rapidly from profound confusion to pure, unadulterated outrage. They looked at Valerie, who was now standing completely alone near the brick entrance. The sympathetic elders who had closely surrounded her mere moments before physically backed away in absolute disgust. People began muttering angrily, demanding their donation checks back. Auntie Brenda stood up, threw her copy of the evidence packet directly at Valerie's feet and permanently turned her back on her. In real time, I watched the entire St. Jude congregation completely abandon my mother. They gathered their children, picked up their purses, and turned away from the fraudulent matriarch. Valerie was left standing in the grass, utterly exposed and totally destroyed. Valerie refused to accept the rapid exodus unfolding before her very eyes. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the nearest folding chair, her knuckles turning bone white as she screamed at the backs of the retreating congregation. She shrieked that they were all ungrateful hypocrite sinners who were turning a blind eye to a family in desperate need. Her voice cracked, echoing harshly across the manicured church lawn, bouncing off the brick facade of the sanctuary. The gospel band was hastily packing up their instruments, refusing to make eye contact with the disgraced matriarch. The air previously filled with the scent of barbecue and community chatter now felt suffocating and toxic. Church ushers were actively dismantling the digital donation kiosks, pulling the plugs from the extension cords and erasing any trace of the fraudulent fundraiser. People were marching to their vehicles in droves, accelerating out of the parking lot to escape the radioactive fallout of my revelations. My father stood frozen near the potato salad station, his eyes darting frantically across the clearing courtyard, the heavy reality of his federal indictment suddenly materializing in front of his entire community. The grand illusion of the untouchable patriarch was completely shattered. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely powerless. I stood motionless on the wooden stage, my crimson designer suit remaining flawlessly crisp, watching the spectacular implosion of their carefully crafted universe. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. They had deliberately built their entire existence on a foundation of malicious lies and relentless exploitation, and gravity had finally come to collect its debt. Valerie spun around to face me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth to unleash another tirade of venomous accusations to blame me for ruining her life. But the shrill, piercing ring of her cell phone abruptly cut her off. The customized ringtone she had specifically assigned to her golden child echoed loudly through the emptying courtyard. She frantically dug into her designer purse, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device onto the grass. She answered the call with a desperate, breathless greeting, fully expecting Trevon to demand an immediate update on the fundraiser. Instead, the sheer, staggering volume of my brother's hysterical screaming forced her to hold the phone completely away from her ear. Even from my position on the stage, I could hear the sheer terror vibrating in his voice. He was not just crying. He was hyperventilating, choking on his own frantic sobs. Valerie demanded to know what was wrong, her own panic instantly skyrocketing as she tried to soothe him through the receiver. Trevon wailed that the situation in the Maldives had catastrophically escalated beyond a simple hotel debt. He screamed that heavily armed men in tactical gear had just kicked down the door to the windowless holding room where he and Chloe had been detained by resort security. The local island police were no longer the ones handling the situation. He sobbed uncontrollably as he explained that the $60,000 in cash Desmond had frantically wired to him was entirely composed of heavily monitored illicit funds. Desmond had arrogantly assumed that selling my corporate Porsche to Dante would simply yield untraceable cash. He had completely failed to realize that Dante was not just a local street thug. Dante was the regional kingpin of a massive, highly sophisticated international chop shop syndicate that had been under active federal surveillance for months. When Desmond wired those specific funds across international borders to the Maldives, he had unknowingly triggered a massive federal alert. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had immediately flagged the transaction, tracking the dirty money directly from the illegal vehicle sale straight into Trevon's overseas bank account. The situation had bypassed local jurisdiction entirely. Trevon hysterically screamed into the phone that Interpol had officially stepped in. The International Police Organization had actively seized him and Chloe, physically restraining them in the resort lobby in front of hundreds of horrified tourists. They were no longer being held for simply defrauding a luxury hotel with stolen credit cards. They were officially being seized for suspected international money laundering and receiving funds directly tied to organized crime. In the background of the call, I could clearly hear Chloe screaming in absolute unhinged terror as foreign authorities placed cold steel handcuffs on her wrists. Trevon wailed that their passports had been permanently confiscated by federal agents and that they were currently being dragged to a heavily armored transport boat. They were not just facing a massive financial debt anymore. They were facing imminent extradition federal prison time and the absolute destruction of their entire lives. He begged his mother to save him, his voice cracking into a pathetic guttural plea before the line abruptly went completely dead. Valerie stared blankly at the silent phone in her hand. The blood entirely left her face, turning her skin a sickening shade of gray. The sheer magnitude of the situation finally breached the thick, impenetrable walls of her delusion. Her golden boy, the flawless son she had worshipped and protected her entire life, was being hauled away by international authorities for money laundering. Her legs violently gave out from underneath her. She dropped the expensive cell phone into the dirt and physically collapsed onto the church lawn, her knees hitting the ground with a dull thud. She let out a guttural, harrowing wail of pure despair, burying her face in her hands, as her entire body shook with uncontrollable sobs. The remaining church members who had lingered near the parking lot watched in horrified silence, completely refusing to step forward and offer her any comfort. Her lies had permanently alienated the very people she had relied upon for salvation. Desmond watched his wife collapse, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. The reality of his actions was closing in on him from every conceivable angle. He had stolen my car, forged federal documents, and dealt with a known criminal syndicate, all to fund a fraudulent vacation. In doing so, he had directly triggered an international incident that was currently tearing his son away in handcuffs. Desmond spun around and marched toward the wooden stage, his eyes wide with a manic, unhinged desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his face twisted into a mask of aggressive patriarchal entitlement. He demanded that I fix this immediately. He commanded me to pick up my phone, call my elite corporate lawyers, and leverage my immense wealth to squash the Interpol investigation. He shouted that I had enough power and influence to make this entire nightmare disappear, and that as his daughter it was my absolute duty to rescue my brother from foreign authorities. He stubbornly believed that he could still order me into submission, that he could bully me into utilizing the very career he had mocked to clean up his monumental criminal disaster. I stood my ground on the wooden stage, looking down at the pathetic, broken man who had spent his entire life trying to diminish my worth. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of fear, hesitation, or familial obligation. I simply stared at him, my expression radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. I slowly smoothed the lapels of my tailored crimson suit, ensuring every single detail of my appearance remained flawlessly intact. I looked at the heavy leather binder resting on the podium, filled with the undeniable proof of their relentless greed and manipulation. I looked at Valerie wailing in the dirt, entirely consumed by the consequences of her own toxic favoritism. I looked back at Desmond, meeting his frantic, demanding gaze with eyes as cold and unforgiving as polished steel. A slow, terrifyingly confident smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had meticulously built an impenetrable fortress and watched her enemies impale themselves on the gates. I leaned forward slightly, making sure my voice was crystal clear, completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. I reminded him that he had maliciously sold my heavily secured corporate vehicle to a known criminal syndicate just to pay for his golden son's lavish, fraudulent vacation. I reminded him that he had actively chosen to steal my identity, drain my resources, and sacrifice my livelihood to fund a life of unearned luxury. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the final devastating truth. I told him that since he had worked so incredibly hard to secure that vacation, his son was now receiving a permanently extended stay. I told him he was absolutely welcome. I did not wait for his response. I did not wait for Valerie to scream my name. I turned my back on them. Both stepped down from the wooden stage and walked across the church courtyard, with the terrifying grace of an untouchable executive. My heavy stiletto heels clicked sharply against the pavement, echoing through the heavy silence of the ruined barbecue. I slid into my rental vehicle, started the engine, and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror, permanently leaving them to burn in the spectacular inferno of their own creation. The tropical inferno consuming my brother escalated with breathtaking speed. Trayvon and Chloe were no longer dealing with angry resort managers demanding payment for luxury excursions. They were trapped in the suffocating grip of an international money laundering investigation, surrounded by heavily armed Interpol agents who did not care about his golden boy status. The terrifying reality of rotting inside a notoriously brutal foreign prison immediately shattered the fragile illusion of their perfect marriage. Chloe was an opportunistic social climber who had married Trayvon strictly for his fabricated wealth. She had eagerly signed up for endless champagne and designer shopping sprees, funded by my stolen identity. She had no intention of becoming a loyal prison wife to a disgraced felon. The moment the cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, her self-preservation instincts violently kicked in. She completely severed her loyalty to my brother without hesitation. Chloe aggressively demanded her legal right to contact the United States Embassy. Once connected with a senior consular official, she immediately threw her new husband directly under the bus. She weaponized her tears, spinning a highly calculated narrative of absolute victimhood. She claimed she was completely blinded by a pathological liar, insisting she had absolutely no knowledge of the stolen credit cards, forged federal documents, or illicit chop shop funds. She painted herself as a terrified hostage trapped by a dangerous criminal. Her survival strategy was incredibly effective. She fully cooperated with international authorities, eagerly providing them with every damning detail of Trayvon's extravagant spending habits. In exchange for her complete cooperation against her husband, the embassy brokered a swift diplomatic deal with Maldivian authorities. Chloe was officially cleared of money laundering charges, processed for deportation, and escorted straight to the airport. Before her commercial flight breached international airspace, she used the wireless internet to contact a domestic attorney. She filed for an emergency remote divorce, completely severing herself from the sinking Addams family. Trayvon was left completely alone in a filthy, sweltering holding cell, stripped of his bride, his stolen wealth, and his freedom, finally facing the devastating international consequences of his arrogance. Chloe's diplomatic escape did not grant her total immunity from the massive domestic fallout. She secured a commercial flight back to American soil, but her paranoia quickly caught up with her. She knew she was still wearing the physical evidence of my stolen identity. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively auditing every fraudulent transaction attached to my compromised accounts, which included the obscenely expensive designer handbags and diamond jewelry she had gleefully purchased. Terrified she would be indicted as a co-conspirator for receiving stolen property, Chloe desperately sought out the only person holding the power to stop the impending federal hammer. She showed up on the doorstep of my secure townhouse exactly 3 days after abandoning my brother. I opened my heavy oak door to find her standing on my porch, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant bride from the social media photos. She looked exhausted and completely terrified. Her expensive mascara was smeared beneath her eyes and her hands were visibly shaking. She launched into a pathetic, desperate performance, sobbing hysterically and begging me to show her mercy. She pleaded with me to formally drop the federal identity theft charges, swearing she was just an innocent victim manipulated by my wicked family. She begged me not to let the authorities ruin her entire life over a few shopping sprees. I stood in the doorway, my posture perfectly rigid, my expression radiating absolute indifference. I did not invite her inside. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not validate her desperate performance. I simply reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a neatly folded piece of cardstock. I calmly extended my hand and offered it to her. Chloe stopped sobbing, looking down at the paper with confusion before slowly taking it. I watched her eyes widen in horror as she read the contents. It was not a legal pardon. It was a meticulously itemized invoice directly from my wealth management firm. The document listed the exact retail value of every single designer handbag and piece of jewelry she had purchased using my stolen funds, complete with compounded interest and severe legal penalty fees. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice barely above a whisper, radiating lethal authority. I explicitly informed her that I did not care about her manufactured tears. I calmly explained she had exactly 72 hours to wire the total owed balance directly into my corporate account, or I would personally hand the itemized list to the federal agents handling Desmond's criminal case. I told her she could either pay for her stolen luxury or explain her complicity to a federal judge. I did not wait for her desperate reply. I simply stepped back, closed the heavy oak door directly in her weeping face, and engaged the deadbolt with a sharp click. The absolute collapse of our family structure left Valerie completely isolated, financially ruined, and totally devoid of her usual manipulative resources. Her community had turned their backs on her, her husband was a federally indicted felon, and her golden child was rotting in a foreign prison. With absolutely nowhere else to turn, she resorted to the ultimate humiliation. She came crawling directly into the belly of the beast. She arrived at my firm's corporate headquarters unannounced, completely bypassing the polished lobby reception and desperately demanding to see me. My security team alerted me immediately, asking if I wanted her forcibly removed. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk, looked across the room at Elijah, and quietly told security to send her up to the executive suite. Valerie walked into my office looking entirely broken. The fierce, judgmental matriarch who had commanded absolute obedience for 3 decades was completely gone. She was trembling, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame, her face pale and lined with severe exhaustion. She collapsed into one of the plush leather chairs opposite my desk. She did not attempt to spin a new web of lies. She did not try to guilt-trip me into saving my brother. She completely dropped the manipulation and resorted to outright humiliating begging. She wept openly, pleading with me to use my corporate lawyers to negotiate Desmond's federal charges. She begged me to unfreeze the accounts, to pay the legal fees, to somehow magically rewind the clock and restore the family she had personally destroyed. She sobbed that she was losing everything and that I was the only one who could stop the bleeding. I sat completely still, my hands folded neatly on the polished wood of my desk. Elijah stood silently by the towering glass window, radiating quiet professional intimidation. I let Valerie weep. I let her pour out every single ounce of her desperation, silently watching the pathetic culmination of her lifelong choices. When she finally ran out of breath and sat gasping in the chair, I smoothly slid a thick dark gray folder across the expansive desk. It stopped perfectly inches from her trembling hands. I instructed her to open it. Valerie reached out her fingers, shaking violently as she flipped the heavy cover open. She stared down at the documents, her tear-filled eyes scanning the bold, uncompromising legal text. I spoke with a voice devoid of any warmth, anger, or familial connection. I formally informed her that she had just been legally served. I explained that the first document was a permanent, legally binding restraining order officially barring her Desmond and Traven from ever coming within a 5-mile radius of my home, my corporate office, or my person. I told her the second document was a massive, uncompromising civil lawsuit filed jointly by my corporate legal team and my personal wealth managers. I was suing her and Desmond for astronomical financial damages, emotional distress, and criminal complicity in the theft of my corporate assets. I calmly stated that I was actively seeking to seize the remaining equity in their Maryland home to fully recoup the losses they had inflicted upon my business. Valerie gasped, clutching her chest. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, realizing that I was not just refusing to help her, I was actively orchestrating her total, permanent destruction. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I looked at the woman who had spent her entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy of basic respect. I told her with chilling finality that my involvement in her life was permanently concluded. I instructed her to leave my office, walk out, and never speak my name again. Elijah stepped forward, opening the heavy glass door of the executive suite, silently indicating that the meeting was over. She stumbled out of the office, a broken woman leaving me to permanently rule the quiet, victorious empire I had methodically built from the burning ashes of her ultimate betrayal. I was finally and entirely free from their toxic grasp forever. The absolute beautiful silence in my office after her pathetic departure was the sound of absolute victory. I did not waste a single solitary second celebrating because my corporate legal team was already moving forward with ruthless, calculated precision. The massive civil suit we filed was an ironclad masterpiece of financial retribution. We relentlessly targeted every single physical asset attached to Desmond and Valerie. The sheer terrifying magnitude of their immediate legal jeopardy was completely suffocating. Desmond was facing aggressive federal prosecutors who possessed an airtight case regarding the identity theft, the forged notary stamps, and the illegal sale of my tracked corporate vehicle. Retaining a competent criminal defense attorney who could even attempt to negotiate a plea deal for those massive felony charges required a six-figure retainer up front. But Desmond's domestic legal disaster was incredibly cheap compared to the international nightmare consuming their golden child. Trayvon was completely stranded in a foreign jurisdiction, aggressively facing severe international money laundering charges. Finding specialized overseas defense counsel capable of navigating Interpol regulations and Maldivian court systems demanded an astronomical influx of liquid cash. Valerie and Desmond were completely trapped. With their joint savings totally eradicated by Desmond's initial bail bond, they had absolutely no cash reserves left. They were forced to turn to the very last symbol of their precious upper-middle-class status. They had to leverage their pristine, sprawling five-bedroom brick home in Bowie, Maryland. For decades, that immaculate house had been Valerie's ultimate crown jewel. She had used that property to project an illusion of flawless prosperity, constantly hosting lavish dinner parties just to silently brag to her neighbors and church friends. Now it was nothing more than a desperate bargaining chip. They quietly took out a massive second mortgage just to pay the initial retainers for the criminal defense teams, but the legal bills aggressively multiplied at a terrifying rate. Federal discovery procedures and international extradition hearings drained their new funds within weeks. Panicking, they took out a predatory third mortgage through a high-interest private lender. They literally signed away the remaining equity of their entire lives simply to keep Desmond out of a federal penitentiary and Trayvon from rotting in an overseas cell. I watched all of this unfold through the clinical detailed updates provided by my legal team. Every update confirmed that the crushing weight of their self-inflicted crisis was slowly bleeding them dry. The financial strain quickly became mathematically impossible for them to survive. The compounding interest rates from the predatory third mortgage combined with the staggering continuous legal invoices created an inescapable financial black hole. Desmond was completely unemployable. His highly publicized federal indictment had permanently destroyed his professional reputation, ensuring no legitimate company would ever hire him. Valerie's modest income could not even cover the basic utility bills, let alone the tens of thousands of dollars required monthly just to service their massive mortgage debts. The collapse was brutal, inevitable, and entirely public. Exactly 4 months after the disastrous church barbecue, the bank formally initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. The official notice was aggressively taped directly to the front door of their beloved Bowie home for the entire neighborhood to see. The pristine illusion Valerie had spent 30 years meticulously crafting was publicly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The local gossip network, the exact same community she had maliciously tried to weaponize against me, now turned their vicious attention directly onto her. Neighbors watched through their living room blinds as process servers continuously arrived at the property. The brutal shame of their public downfall was a poison they had to swallow every single day. They had spent my entire life looking down their noses at me, treating my ambitions as secondary and my career as a convenient joke. They had arrogant, unshakable confidence in their own superiority. Now they were officially destitute. Facing an absolute lack of options and the impending seizure of their home, Desmond and Valerie were legally forced to file for complete Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The federal bankruptcy courts aggressively liquidated every single remaining asset they possessed. Their expensive luxury vehicles were violently repossessed by tow trucks in the middle of the night. Their joint bank accounts were completely zeroed out. The court mandated the immediate public auction of their sprawling brick house to satisfy the angry creditors. The Golden family of Bowie, Maryland was permanently erased from the upper middle class registry. They were reduced to nothing, entirely stripped of the unearned arrogance that had fueled their lifelong mistreatment of me. They were finally forced to experience the exact same terrifying helplessness they had so eagerly tried to force upon me when they maliciously drained my corporate accounts. The stark juxtaposition between our two realities was sharp, poetic, and absolutely definitive. While Desmond and Valerie were weeping in their empty Maryland driveway, aggressively packing their meager remaining belongings into cheap cardboard boxes, I was sitting in the secure executive boardroom of my wealth management firm. I was not packing boxes. I was aggressively closing the single biggest financial quarter in the entire history of our corporate division. My focused, unrelenting dedication to my career had yielded massive, undeniable dividends. I had successfully managed highly complex portfolios, navigated extreme market volatility, and secured highly lucrative accounts that cemented my reputation as a financial powerhouse. I had taken the brutal, chaotic energy of my family's betrayal and efficiently channeled every single ounce of it directly into my professional advancement. The results were spectacular. Elijah stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, holding a crystal glass of expensive sparkling water. He looked across the boardroom at the senior partners, a rare, genuine smile gracing his usually stoic features. He formally announced to the entire executive team that my exceptional performance, unwavering dedication, and brilliant strategic mind had earned me the ultimate corporate reward. I was officially being promoted to junior partner. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, and the support staff wheeled in a silver cart carrying vintage champagne. The senior partners stood up, clapping loudly, welcoming me into the elite upper echelon of the firm. I accepted a crystal flute, the cool glass grounding me in the reality of my absolute triumph. I had built this empire completely on my own. I had clawed my way to the top of a ruthless industry without a single drop of familial support. In fact, I had achieved this monumental milestone while actively fighting off a malicious organized attack from my own blood relatives. My new title came with a massive corner office, a highly lucrative profit-sharing agreement, and an unshakable level of corporate authority. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom and looked down at the bustling city streets far below. The view was breathtaking. I thought about my parents currently loading their heavily taped cardboard boxes into a rented moving truck. They were leaving their massive suburban mansion to squeeze into a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Desmond was still wearing his federally mandated ankle monitor, anxiously awaiting his criminal sentencing hearing. Valerie was entirely broken, isolated from her church friends, and working a grueling minimum wage retail job just to buy cheap groceries. Trevin remained completely trapped in a foreign holding facility, facing a terrifying international trial with incredibly incompetent bargain rate defense lawyers because the funds had completely dried up. His glamorous new bride had successfully divorced him and vanished entirely, leaving him to face the devastating consequences of his own monumental greed entirely alone. Their absolute ruin was not a tragic accident. It was the direct, undeniable result of their own malicious choices. They had deliberately chosen to steal, to forge, and to manipulate. They had arrogantly assumed I would simply bow down and absorb their criminal fallout because I was the dutiful, unappreciated daughter. They severely underestimated the cold, calculated wrath of a woman who knew her true worth. They tried to burn my world to the ground to keep their golden boy warm. Instead, they ignited a massive inferno that completely incinerated their own lives. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my vintage champagne. The crisp, chilled liquid tasted like absolute victory. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or lingering sadness. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of peace. I had successfully protected my hard-earned assets, defended my immaculate professional reputation, and permanently severed the toxic anchors that had tried to drag me into the deep abyss. I placed my crystal flute down on the polished mahogany table and smoothed the lapels of my tailored designer suit. I was no longer the invisible sister or the unappreciated daughter. I was Zuri, a powerful, fiercely independent junior partner who had ruthlessly conquered every single obstacle in her path. I smiled brightly, turned away from the glass window, and confidently walked back toward my waiting colleagues. The painful past was permanently packed away in those cheap cardboard boxes, but my brilliant, unwritten future was just beginning. 7 months later, heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open, revealing a sterile, imposing theater of absolute justice. The air inside the courtroom was aggressively cold, carrying a sharp metallic scent of floor wax and impending doom. I walked down the center aisle with calculated, unhurried precision. My charcoal gray designer suit acted as a physical shield against the heavy stares of the sparse gallery. Elijah walked silently beside me, radiating his usual brand of intimidating professional composure. We took our seats in the front row directly behind the prosecutor. Across the aisle, Desmond sat. His trademark arrogance had entirely evaporated. The tailored suits he used to wear with such unwarranted pride had been replaced by a cheap, loose-fitting gray jacket that swallowed his diminished frame. He looked incredibly old, his skin gray and sagging under the harsh fluorescent lights. Valerie sat completely alone in the gallery section directly behind him. The supportive church elders and gossiping neighbors who used to flank her like a royal guard were entirely absent. Her physical deterioration was genuinely staggering. The expensive highlights in her hair had faded into a dull, brassy gray, and her designer clothes vanished. The moment I sat down, she locked her wet eyes onto the back of my head. She began weeping loudly, blowing her nose into a crumpled tissue, aggressively attempting to project the image of a heartbroken mother desperately seeking familial reconciliation. She was pathetically hoping that the sheer visual weight of her manufactured suffering would somehow break my resolve. She foolishly believed that when I took the witness stand, I would suddenly display mercy and soften the federal charges out of some lingering, misguided sense of daughterly obligation. I did not give her a single glance of any absolute pity. The bailiff called my name loudly, and the crisp sound echoed sharply against the dark wooden walls. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, and walked toward the witness box with unwavering confidence. I placed my right hand on the Bible, looked the clerk dead in the eyes, and swore to tell the complete, unvarnished truth. I sat down and adjusted the microphone. The federal prosecutor, a sharp, unyielding woman named Sarah Hayes, approached the podium. She guided me methodically through the initial timeline of the crime. I answered her questions with crystal clear surgical precision without flinching. I detailed exactly how my corporate vehicle was completely secured, how the keys were maliciously stolen from my locked office drawer during a fabricated family dinner, and how my personal identifying information was illegally accessed through a massive breach of trust. My voice remained completely steady, echoing through the silent room. When the prosecutor finished laying the damning foundation, Desmond and his bargain-rate defense attorney approached the stand. He was a nervous, sweating man who clearly understood he was fighting an entirely unwinnable battle. He aggressively shuffled his legal pads, attempting to project a false sense of aggressive confidence. He began his cross-examination by attempting to reframe the entire federal indictment as a simple domestic dispute. He offered a condescending smile and asked if it was not true that families often shared vehicles without explicit written permission. He suggested that my father, acting out of a misguided but ultimately loving sense of patriarchal duty, was simply trying to help my brother during a temporary financial crisis. He boldly attempted to paint the illegal sale of a $100,000 corporate asset as a mere family misunderstanding, aggressively implying that I was simply a vindictive daughter actively overreacting today. I did not flinch. I let his pathetic, condescending narrative hang in the cold courtroom air for a few agonizing seconds before I completely dismantled it. I leaned directly into the microphone and locked my eyes onto the sweating defense attorney. I informed him with icy, lethal calmness that borrowing a family car to run an errand is a domestic arrangement. I explicitly stated that stealing a federally registered corporate asset, driving it across state lines, utilizing a forged notary stamp to illegally transfer the heavy title, and fencing the vehicle to a known chop shop syndicate is a felony. The defense attorney sputtered, attempting to interrupt my momentum, but I aggressively spoke over him. I turned my attention directly to the sitting federal judge and requested permission to direct the court to Exhibit 4, a heavily detailed document packet I had personally prepared for the prosecution. The judge nodded, and the prosecutor quickly handed the thick packets to the defense and the bench. I methodically walked the entirely silent courtroom through the absolute undeniable paper trail. I pointed to the specific time-stamped emails Desmond had sent to fraudulent buyers actively negotiating the illegal sale price of my beautiful vehicle. I explicitly noted he did this while I was physically sitting across from him at a family dinner. I highlighted the glaring, undeniable discrepancies in the forged notary signature, explicitly detailing how my father had utilized stolen company letterhead to fabricate the transfer documents. I did not leave a single microscopic fraction of a doubt. I directed the judge to the final page of the packet, which displayed the raw, unalterable satellite tracking logs extracted directly from the corporate system. The data explicitly tracked my vehicle moving directly from my secure garage to the exact location of the criminal warehouse. I explicitly explained that the tracking timestamps perfectly aligned with the exact moments Desmond had deceitfully excused himself from our dinner table, claiming he needed to take a business call. The defense attorney stood completely frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His pathetic family misunderstanding defense had just been violently incinerated by cold, hard, verifiable data. He cast a desperate, panicked look back at Desmond, who was now staring down at his own trembling hands, visibly shrinking into his chair. Valerie let out a loud, theatrical wail from the crowded gallery section. She completely failed to generate any sympathy from the hardened courtroom staff. The judge aggressively struck his gavel, warning Valerie that she would be forcibly removed if she disrupted the proceedings again. I finished my testimony by explicitly stating the exact financial damage my firm had suffered due to his theft. The defense attorney quickly mumbled that he had no further questions and practically ran back to his seat. The prosecutor offered me a small, respectful nod as I was officially dismissed from the witness stand. I stood up, the sharp click of my heels breaking the heavy silence today. I walked back to my seat beside Elijah. I did not look at Desmond. I did not look at Valerie. I kept my eyes fixed perfectly forward, radiating absolute, unshakable confidence always. The prosecution rested their case immediately after my testimony, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had secured a flawless victory. The defense offered no witnesses, fully aware that any attempt to put Desmond on the stand would only result in a devastating cross-examination that would compound his guilt. The jury deliberation was incredibly brief. They were sequestered for barely 2 hours. Time officially stopped. The judge, a formidable man with a reputation for absolute intolerance regarding corporate crime, ordered the defendant to stand. Desmond slowly rose to his feet, his knees visibly buckling, forcing his attorney to physically support his arm. The jury foreperson stood up and clearly read the verdict aloud. On the federal charge of grand theft auto, guilty. On the federal charge of identity theft, guilty. On the federal charge of utilizing forged documents to execute wire fraud, guilty. Valerie let out a sharp, choked gasp, collapsing against the hard wooden back of her gallery bench in absolute horror. The judge bypassed the usual delay for sentencing, aggressively proceeding directly to his final ruling. He glared down at Desmond with profound disgust, explicitly condemning him for exhibiting absolutely zero remorse throughout the entire trial. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a sharp crack. Desmond was formally sentenced to 84 months in a high-security federal penitentiary, completely without the possibility of early parole. 2 heavy-set federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbed his arms, and secured his wrists with cold steel handcuffs. The untouchable patriarch was now officially a federal inmate. As I calmly stood up to leave the courtroom, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my jacket pocket. Elijah checked his own device simultaneously, his eyes widening slightly before he handed the screen toward me. It was a breaking alert from my dedicated security team. The news was absolutely staggering. After months of rotting in a filthy Maldivian holding facility, Traven had just been successfully extradited back to American soil. Heavily armed federal agents had officially intercepted him at the airport. He was immediately processed and thrown straight into absolute unyielding federal custody. Both Golden Child and Patriarch were caged. The federal machinery had executed its absolute purpose with flawless, devastating efficiency. I stood in the corridor of the courthouse, the marble floor cold and unyielding beneath my designer heels, absorbing the monumental magnitude of the breaking news. Trayvon was completely secured in a federal holding cell, stripped of his designer silk shirts and forced into a standard-issue jumpsuit. Desmond was already being processed for his 84-month sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. The two men who had arrogantly believed they were entirely untouchable, who had maliciously drained my resources to fund their spectacular delusions of grandeur, were now permanently caged like the common criminals they truly were. I did not celebrate with wild cheers or public displays of emotion. My victory was silent, absolute, and profoundly, deeply satisfying. I walked out of the federal building and stepped into the crisp, biting air of the city, my mind already transitioning back to the aggressive, demanding rhythm of my corporate empire. I had a massive, highly lucrative portfolio to manage. I had newly acquired junior partner responsibilities that demanded my absolute, undivided attention. The radioactive debris of my former family was no longer my concern. They had been surgically excised from my existence. 6 weeks passed with the rhythmic, relentless precision of a perfectly calibrated luxury timepiece. My professional life skyrocketed to unprecedented heights of success. I moved into my sprawling, immaculate corner office, commanding sweeping panoramic views of the entire downtown financial district. I was aggressively closing multi-million-dollar international accounts, completely dominating boardroom negotiations, and cementing my absolute authority within the elite hierarchy of the firm. The massive civil suit against my parents had concluded exactly as my aggressive legal team had projected. The bank had swiftly finalized the absolute foreclosure of their pristine Bowie mansion. The property had been ruthlessly auctioned off to satisfy their towering, insurmountable debts. Through the clinical detached updates provided by my private security team, I was kept fully aware of Valerie's pathetic new reality. She had been physically forced to relocate into a cramped, dilapidated, profoundly depressing one-bedroom apartment situated in the most undesirable, neglected sector of the city. She was completely isolated, entirely stripped of her precious social standing, and working a grueling, physically demanding minimum wage retail job just to afford basic generic groceries. The golden matriarch had been reduced to an absolute shadow, entirely crushed beneath the monumental weight of her own malicious choices. I truly believe the toxic chapter was permanently closed. I had severely underestimated the desperate, unhinged audacity of a woman who had completely lost her mind. It happened late on a Friday evening. I had just finished aggressively auditing a massive corporate acquisition file and was finally leaving the firm. The executive parking garage beneath my corporate headquarters was completely deserted, a vast, echoing cavern of gray concrete and harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of vehicle exhaust and damp pavement. I walked purposefully toward my brand new, flawlessly polished jet black Porsche Panamera, the aggressive clicking of my stilettos echoing sharply against the concrete pillars. I clicked my key fob, the vehicle's lights flashing with a sharp, welcoming chirp. I reached out to open the heavy driver's side door when a sudden erratic movement in the dark shadows completely shattered the silence. A figure aggressively stepped out from behind a massive concrete support pillar, physically blocking my path to the driver's side door. My elite personal security instincts instantly flared my hand, immediately dropping into my designer handbag to grip the heavy canister of professional-grade pepper spray. But as the harsh fluorescent parking garage lights illuminated the desperate intruder, my adrenaline immediately shifted into pure, unadulterated disgust. It was Valerie. She was actively, brazenly violating the strict federally mandated permanent restraining order I had legally placed against her. I stood completely frozen, my posture radiating an icy, lethal calmness, and simply absorbed the shocking, catastrophic physical deterioration of the woman standing before me. Valerie looked absolutely horrifying. The pristine, flawlessly groomed church matriarch who had constantly weaponized her immaculate appearance to judge everyone around her was completely eradicated. She looked as though she had violently aged 20 years in the span of a few short months. Her once perfectly maintained, expensive hair was now a tangled, frizzy, overgrown mess of dull gray and brassy roots. Her skin was deeply lined, sallow, and sagging heavily around her jawline, completely devoid of any expensive cosmetic enhancements. She was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting, terribly stained beige trench coat that hung off her significantly diminished, bony frame. Her hands were shaking violently, clutching a battered generic imitation leather purse. She reeked of stale coffee, cheap laundry detergent, and the unmistakable, suffocating stench of pure, unadulterated desperation. She looked like a feral, cornered animal, entirely broken by the cruel reality of the consequences she had so arrogantly invited into her life. I did not reach for my cell phone to dial my security team. I did not aggressively scream for building assistance. I simply stood there, my pristine, tailored charcoal suit acting as a visual weapon against her pathetic, ragged appearance. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of delusional, manufactured garbage she had risked federal arrest to deliver. I wanted to witness the absolute final gasp of her dying manipulation. Valerie took a trembling, hesitant step forward, her eyes wide, watery, and bloodshot. She looked at my new, obscenely expensive vehicle, then looked at my flawless, powerful presentation, and a spasm of bitter, helpless rage twisted her sagging features. She opened her mouth, and her voice emerged as a harsh, raspy, wet croak, completely lacking the booming, righteous, theatrical authority she had always commanded in the past. She launched into her final pathetic guilt trip, her hands waving frantically in the cold garage air. She aggressively accused me of being a heartless, psychotic monster. She screamed that I was actively enjoying her spectacular suffering, that I was maliciously gloating while my own father and brother were rotting away in concrete federal cages. She sobbed heavily, wiping her wet, dripping nose with the back of her trembling, wrinkled hand, aggressively ignoring every single boundary of human decency. She took another desperate step toward me, her voice escalating into a shrill, hysterical screech that bounced harshly off the concrete walls. She looked me directly in the eyes, tears streaming down her deeply lined face, and delivered the ultimate, desperate manipulation she had utilized her entire life. She aggressively screamed, "You destroyed this family over a car and some credit cards. We are your blood." The words hung heavily in the freezing, stagnant air of the parking garage. She stood there panting, her chest heaving violently under her stained beige coat, desperately waiting for her toxic manipulation to finally penetrate my armor. She foolishly, tragically believed that invoking the sacred, untouchable concept of blood relation would somehow magically erase the towering mountain of financial ruin, emotional abuse, and criminal exploitation she had actively orchestrated against me. She actually expected me to crumble, to weep, to beg for her maternal forgiveness, and to instantly leverage my massive corporate wealth to rescue her from the squalor of her new pathetic apartment. I stared at her. I did not blink. I did not display a single microscopic fraction of sympathy, anger, or sadness. I let her desperate screaming echo completely die away in the vast, empty concrete cavern. I looked at her haggard, desperate face, and I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord that had tethered me to this toxic, manipulative woman for my entire life had already been completely severed, burned, and scattered to the wind. I was looking at a total stranger. A pathetic, delusional stranger who had fundamentally misunderstood the dangerous, lethal power of the woman she had created. I took one slow, deliberate step toward her. The sharp, aggressive echo of my heel striking the concrete caused her to physically flinch backward. I looked directly into her terrified, bloodshot eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, radiating a chilling, absolute, and lethal corporate finality. I did not yell. I did not scream. I delivered the absolute devastating truth with surgical, uncompromising precision. You didn't love me, Mom. I stated the word feeling foreign and completely dead on my tongue. You loved what you could extract from me. You broke the family the second you decided my livelihood was just funding for Trayvon's ego. I just handed you the bill. Valerie physically recoiled as if I had aggressively struck her directly across the face. Her mouth opened in a silent, horrified gasp, her trembling hands flying up to cover her quivering lips. The absolute, unshakable finality of my words completely penetrated her thick, delusional armor. She finally understood in that exact freezing moment that she had absolutely no power left. Her golden child was gone. Her obedient husband was gone. Her massive house, her social standing, and her pristine reputation were permanently gone. And the daughter she had relentlessly treated as an endless, disposable financial resource was now an untouchable, incredibly powerful adversary who had entirely orchestrated her total destruction. She was completely, utterly, and permanently alone. I did not offer her a single additional second of my highly valuable time. I smoothly turned my back on her pathetic, sobbing form. I reached out, grasped the cold, polished handle of my Porsche, and effortlessly pulled the heavy door open. I gracefully slid into the pristine, luxurious leather interior of the driver's seat, the sharp scent of expensive new car completely erasing the foul stench of her desperation. I aggressively pulled the heavy door shut, sealing myself inside my own perfect, impenetrable fortress. I pressed the ignition button, and the powerful, incredibly aggressive engine roared to life with a deep, menacing growl that violently shook the concrete walls of the parking garage. Through the heavily tinted soundproof glass of my window, I watched Valerie briefly. She was standing completely frozen in the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept openly into her dirty hands. She looked incredibly small, deeply pathetic, and entirely defeated. I engaged the transmission, gripping the smooth leather steering wheel with absolute confidence. I firmly pressed my stiletto heel against the accelerator pedal. The luxury vehicle aggressively surged forward, the powerful tires gripping the cold concrete pavement. I drove swiftly and purposefully toward the exit ramp of the parking garage, leaving Valerie completely abandoned in the cold, echoing darkness. I merged smoothly onto the bright, bustling, vibrant city streets, accelerating rapidly toward my flawless, beautifully unwritten future, permanently leaving the toxic, burning wreckage of my former family entirely in the dust. I was finally, absolutely, and unequivocally free. Exactly 1 year after I drove out of that freezing concrete parking garage, leaving Valerie sobbing in the dust, I stood on the sprawling glass balcony of my brand new, multi-million-dollar penthouse. The warm air of the Washington, D.C. summer wrapped around me like a luxurious cloak. Far below, the vibrant lights of the capital city stretched out into the infinite distance, a glittering testament to power and absolute consequence. This was my sanctuary. I had purchased the top floor of the most exclusive residential high-rise in the entire district. The architectural masterpiece featured soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of the Potomac River and imported marble floors that mirrored the flawless trajectory of my executive life. The magnitude of my financial ascension was undeniable. I was no longer just a junior partner. I was a recognized, heavily respected titan within the aggressive world of wealth management. The toxic anchor of my former family had been severed, and without their parasitic weight dragging me down, my professional trajectory had skyrocketed. I took a slow, satisfying sip of vintage champagne from a crystal flute, letting the chilled liquid ground me in the perfection of my current reality. Ambient jazz drifted through the sliding glass doors behind me, mingling with the sophisticated hum of elite conversation. I was hosting an exclusive celebration to commemorate the closing of a record-breaking corporate merger. My firm had not merely supported me during the malicious legal attacks orchestrated by my blood relatives. They had aggressively rewarded my unyielding resilience, my clinical focus, and my ruthless ability to compartmentalize personal trauma while delivering spectacular financial dividends. I turned away from the glowing city skyline and stepped back into the massive open concept living area of my penthouse. The room was populated by the most influential, powerful figures in the financial sector. Senior partners, elite clients, and corporate strategists mingled comfortably, holding expensive cocktails and discussing international markets. I glided through the room with absolute confidence, accepting respectful nods and genuine congratulations. Standing near the custom marble kitchen island was Elijah. The stoic, unyielding executive who had once been my intimidating superior was now my closest confidant and fiercely loyal friend. He held a glass of expensive bourbon, his sharp eyes scanning the room before locking onto me. A rare, genuine smile broke across his usually impassive face as I approached. He raised his glass in a silent, deeply respectful toast. He knew exactly what it had cost me to build this flawless empire. He had witnessed the absolute depths of my family's depravity, and he had stood shoulder to shoulder with me as we ruthlessly dismantled their pathetic conspiracy. My promotion to senior executive director was a direct result of the unshakable partnership we had forged in the brutal fires of that conflict. Elijah leaned in, his voice low and carrying the heavy weight of absolute mutual respect. He quietly congratulated me on orchestrating the most flawless corporate victory the firm had ever witnessed. We had completely shattered our quarterly projections, securing a massive bonus structure that instantly elevated my personal net worth. The firm had formally recognized that a woman who could clinically incinerate a malicious attack from her own relatives was a woman who could absolutely conquer any global market. My resilience was a highly prized corporate asset. I stood beside Elijah, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I looked around the room at the empire I had built completely with my own two hands. There were no forged documents here. There were no predatory mortgages, no stolen assets, and absolutely no parasitic relatives waiting to drain my resources. Desmond was currently serving his second year in a maximum security federal penitentiary, stripped of his freedom and his unearned pride. Trayvon was locked away in a separate federal facility, entirely isolated and facing the terrifying reality of a decade behind concrete walls. Valerie was permanently exiled to her miserable, cramped apartment, totally erased from my existence. She had attempted to call from a blocked number exactly twice over the past year. I had my personal security team legally block the routing and dispatch a formal warning that immediately shut down any further attempts at contact. They were completely, utterly gone. I had not merely survived their malicious, orchestrated betrayal. I had clinically orchestrated their absolute reckoning. I had handed them this massive, crushing bill for their own staggering entitlement, and I had watched with cold satisfaction as it financially and legally incinerated their entire lives. They had arrogantly tried to burn my world to the ground. Instead, they had unwittingly provided the exact fuel I needed to forge an impenetrable, bulletproof reality. I excused myself from the lively conversation, offering a polite, radiant smile to my elite guests. The celebration was a massive success, but my mind was already anticipating the ultimate solitary victory lap. I handed my crystal flute to a passing server and walked purposefully toward the private elevator. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The steel doors slid open with a soft whisper. I stepped inside, and the elevator descended toward the heavily fortified subterranean parking garage reserved for penthouse owners. The doors opened into a pristine, brightly lit concrete sanctuary. I walked across the polished floor, my stilettos clicking with authority. Sitting directly under the harsh security lights was my ultimate reward. It was my brand new, heavily upgraded custom corporate vehicle, a flawless aerodynamic Porsche 911 Turbo S. I gracefully opened the heavy, perfectly balanced door and slid into the pristine, custom-stitched leather driver's seat. I firmly pressed the ignition button, instantly feeling the deep guttural purr of the massive, twin-turbocharged engine violently vibrating right through my chest. I didn't just survive my family's malicious betrayal. I clinically orchestrated their absolute reckoning, permanently protecting my peace and my empire. I firmly engaged the heavy transmission and smoothly drove out into the vibrant, glowing city lights, completely free.